Imagine you are a German commander in the summer of 1944. Your scouts come back with a report. There is an entire American division on the move. 15,000 soldiers, dozens of tanks, artillery pieces lined up along the ridge. The radio intercepts confirm it. You can hear their communications. Your agents have spotted their unit patches. You've seen the convoys with your own eyes. So you pull your forces back. You reinforce a different position. You call in your reserves. You make your entire battle plan around stopping this massive American force. And then you find out there was nobody there. No soldiers, no tanks, no artillery, just a few hundred Americans. Most of them painters, actors, and sound engineers. Armed with rubber inflatables, a record player, and enough confidence to bluff an entire army. And this is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known by the name history gave them, the Ghost Army. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Europe was underway. D-Day had happened. The beaches of Normandy had been stormed at terrible cost. But the hard truth was this: the Germans were not broken. They were reorganizing, digging in, and fighting for every mile of French countryside with the desperation of soldiers who knew what defeat would mean. The Allied command had a problem. They needed to move their real fighting divisions, their tanks, their artillery, their infantry, across hundreds of miles of contested territory. And every time a division moved, it created a gap, a hole in the line, a place where the Germans could punch through. What they needed was a way to make the Germans think the line was still full, to hold enemy forces in place, to keep German commanders guessing, to buy time for the real army to reposition. What they built was one of the most creative military units in the history of warfare. The idea came from a British deception program called the London Controlling Section. The same people responsible for Operation Bodyguard, the massive deception campaign that had convinced Hitler the real D-Day invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. The British had proven something remarkable. In modern warfare, making the enemy believe something false could be just as powerful as any tank or artillery shell. The Americans took that idea and ran with it. In the spring of 1944, the United States Army began quietly assembling a unit unlike anything that had ever existed. They didn't recruit from the usual places. They didn't go looking for the toughest soldiers or the most decorated veterans. They went looking for artists. The recruitment notices were unusual, to put it mildly. The Army was looking for men with backgrounds in illustration, design, sound engineering, acting, and radio. They recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, theater companies, and film studios. What they assembled was extraordinary. Among the men of the Ghost Army were Ellsworth Kelly, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated abstract painters in American art history. Bill Blass, who after the war would build one of the most iconic fashion empires in the world. Arthur Singer, whose bird illustrations would later grace the covers of National Geographic. Numerous painters, sculptors, set designers, and radio performers who would define American creative culture for decades after the war. These were not soldiers in any traditional sense. They were imaginative, unconventional, and deeply creative. And that was precisely the point. The unit was divided into 4 companies, each with a different specialty. Together, they could stage what amounted to a theatrical production, except the stage was the French countryside and the audience was the German army, and getting the performance wrong meant people died. The first weapon in their arsenal was the simplest and the most absurd-looking: inflatable tanks. These were full-scale rubber replicas of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, jeeps, and trucks. Deflated, they could be folded up and carried by 2 men. Inflated, they looked, from any reasonable distance, and especially from the air, exactly like the real thing. A team of soldiers could set up a fake armored division in a matter of hours. Dozens of rubber tanks arranged in a field, tracks dragged through the mud to simulate movement, netting thrown over some to suggest camouflage. To a German reconnaissance plane flying overhead or to distant enemy observers, it looked like an entire armored force had just arrived. But the Ghost Army didn't stop at visual deception. They understood something that most military planners of the era had barely begun to think about. Modern warfare runs on information, and information has vulnerabilities. The second weapon was sound. But the Army's Signal Company Special, the audio unit of the Ghost Army, had developed something genuinely astonishing for 1944. A mobile sound system powerful enough to broadcast recorded audio up to 15 miles. They spent months before deployment recording sounds. The clanking of tank treads on pavement, the rumble of truck convoys, soldiers shouting, equipment being unloaded, the particular sounds of a division on the move, settling into a new position, preparing for an assault. These recordings were pressed onto large disc records and loaded into half-tracks, military vehicles, which drove along roads near the front lines in the dead of night, playing the sounds of an army that wasn't there. 15 miles. That sound carried 15 miles into enemy territory. And to a German soldier in a foxhole listening to the darkness, it was indistinguishable from the real thing. The third weapon was perhaps the most elegant of all. Radio deception. Every military unit has a radio signature, a rhythm, a style, a set of patterns in how it communicates. Experienced radio operators develop something almost like a fingerprint in the way they key their Morse code. The Germans had radio intelligence units whose entire job was to track American formations by listening to their communications. The Ghost Army had radio operators who could forge those fingerprints. Before a real American division moved out of a position, Ghost Army radio operators would study that division's communications for days, learning the cadence, the phrasing, the individual operators. When the real division departed, the Ghost Army operators took over, continuing the communications as if nothing had changed. To German intelligence listening in, the division was still there. It was identity theft, practiced at the scale of an entire army, in real time, under fire. The fourth weapon was the most human, and in some ways, the most dangerous. Atmosphere operations. The Ghost Army soldiers didn't just build fake positions and broadcast fake sounds. They went into towns. They sat in cafes. They visited bars. They wore unit patches of the divisions they were impersonating, drove vehicles with the wrong markings, dropped the right names, and let rumors do the rest. They understood that a town full of French civilians was a sieve, not out of disloyalty, but because people talk. A French farmer who saw American soldiers wearing the patches of the 2nd Armored Division and drinking coffee in the village square would mention it to his neighbor. His neighbor might mention it to someone else. And somewhere in that chain of ordinary human conversation, a German intelligence agent would hear it and file a report. The Ghost Army was seeding those rumors deliberately, feeding the German intelligence network with exactly the false picture they wanted it to have. They were running a deception operation in which every villager, every bartender, every casual observer was an unwitting participant. Now, did it work? It worked so well that for 50 years, almost nobody knew it had happened. The entire operation was classified until 1996. The men of the Ghost Army came home, went back to their art studios and their design firms and their acting classes, and said nothing. Some of them didn't tell their own families what they had done until they were old men. But the record, once declassified, was remarkable. The Ghost Army ran more than 20 major deception operations between their arrival in France in the summer of 1944 and the end of the war in May 1945. They impersonated at least 35 different American units. They were deployed up and down the front lines, wherever a gap needed to be masked, wherever the Germans needed to be held in place, wherever the real American army needed time to move without being noticed. Military historians who have studied the operations believe the Ghost Army's deceptions saved tens of thousands of American lives. Every time the Germans held their position because they believed a phantom force was facing them, every time a German commander hesitated, pulled back, or redirected his reserves, real American soldiers somewhere else lived through a battle that might otherwise have been catastrophic. Their last and arguably most important operation came in March 1945, just weeks before the end of the war in Europe, Operation Viersen. The Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier before the German heartland. General Dwight Eisenhower needed the crossing to succeed, and he needed the Germans to be looking in the wrong direction when it happened. The Ghost Army was deployed to the south, near the town of Viersen. They set up a fake crossing operation, inflatable tanks and landing craft, fake radio traffic, the full sound arsenal, designed to convince the Germans that the main crossing would happen there. Meanwhile, the real crossing was prepared 30 miles to the north. The deception worked. German forces concentrated to meet the threat that wasn't there. The real Allied crossing, Operation Plunder, went forward with far less resistance than it would otherwise have faced. Thousands of soldiers crossed the Rhine. The road into Germany was open, and the men responsible for clearing that road were carrying paintbrushes and record players. There is something almost impossibly poetic about the Ghost Army. Here is a war that killed 60 million people. A war of industrial-scale destruction, of cities reduced to rubble, of mechanized slaughter on a scale the world had never seen and has not seen since. A war defined by violence, and somewhere inside that war, quietly, almost invisibly, was a group of young men who looked at the problem and said, "What if we didn't fight at all? What if we just made them believe?" They used the skills of artists, not soldiers. They used imagination as a weapon. They used the human tendency to believe what we see and hear, the deep psychological reflex that says if the tanks are there, and the radio traffic is there, and the sounds are there, then the army must be there. And they turned it against an enemy that prided itself on military precision and intelligence superiority. They beat the German army with theater. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2022, nearly 80 years after they first inflated a rubber tank in a French field and dared to believe that art could stop a war. And many of them were not alive to receive it, but their story survived. And sometimes, in a world that tends to celebrate the loudest weapons and the biggest explosions, it is worth stopping to remember the men who won their battles in silence, with a paintbrush, a microphone, and an idea. This was the Ghost Army. They were never really there, and that was the whole point. If this story moved you, please subscribe. There are more forgotten chapters of history waiting to be told. Thank you for watching.